Let's begin. Our next session is a conversation between Ed Boyajian, President and CEO of EDB, Bill Cook, CEO of Yugabyte, and Karthik Ranganathan, CTO and co-founder of Yugabyte. Ed Boyajian drives the development and execution of EDB's strategic vision and growth strategy in the database industry, steering the company through 45 consecutive quarters of recurring revenue growth. Ed has over 15 years of experience in the open source software movement. He is a seasoned enterprise software executive who emphasizes that EDB must be a technology first business in order to lead the open source data management ecosystem. Ed joined EDB in 2008 from Red Hat, where he rose to VP and General Manager of North America. At Red Hat, Ed played a central leadership role in the development of the modern business model for bringing open source to enterprises. Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Sudha. Hey, Ed, good to see you. I was smiling during the introduction because whenever I hear the word seasoned, I translate that into old. And I'm older than you are, so I can say that, but welcome.
Thanks.
Hey, I mean, you and I have known each other, I think, close to 15 years now, given, my background when I was CEO of Greenplum, and we were in the database world on the analytics side of the equation, and obviously now at Yugabyte. So I thought we'd kick this off with you maybe providing your perspective on the industry. Like if you pull up a level and say what's gone on over the last decade or so in the database world, and then obviously specifically Postgres and EDB, if you could comment about that, that would be helpful, I think, to our audience.
Great. Yeah, Bill, thanks. Great to see you. And I appreciate your sentiment about seasoned as well. And it's not often somebody's in a company as long as I've been. I think you've traversed a few companies. I've been in EDB for 13 years now. So that's an interesting perspective because I've been able to see through a single company lens what's been changing in the landscape of the database market, but maybe more importantly, the landscape of open source database. And I think there have been some pretty important drivers for change that I think have the end point, which we're familiar with, is the accelerating prominence of technologies like Postgres. Although it's not just Postgres, but clearly Postgres has that that kind of late that popularity. What's changed in my mind, particularly from the beginning. Now I came from Red Hat, so I'd been around open source. I was at Red Hat in 2008, so my legacy was working with open source technologies before open source was popular. And I think we've seen a couple of really important things happen in and around data. I mean, we know, kind of first, I think among many things that the focus of development has really become distributed across enterprise. And I think it'd be too generous to call it commoditized, but it's moving there. And I think with that, we've enabled businesses and organizations to do more, to create more insight and in turn create more data. You layer on that in the 13 years since I've been here, the addition of so many devices that are themselves generators of data. We've now, the combination of things has really changed the way we think about running businesses using information and insights from the data that we have. I think so. Right alongside that change, I think the database market itself has transformed in response to that. Postgres is a SQL relational database, as you guys well know, but it's open source, which makes it pretty compelling both from a technology point of view, but also from a total cost of ownership and price performance point of view. And I think that's where, as data explodes, as there are more people engaged in thinking about writing apps, like the legacy vendors have really come under fire and pressure by open source technologies like Postgres. And there's been a shocking transformation. So it's not just a transformation, a business transformation. I think there's the database market transformation that's happening simultaneously with the world that we talk about, a digital transformation. And Postgres keeps stepping forward. I don't think our 45 quarters of consecutive growth is a coincidence. We're not just benefiting from what's happening in Postgres, we're creating it. And so I think, you put those things together, and that's such a big part of what's creating change in the database category.
Yeah, totally agree. And maybe Karthik, you have a different perspective, or a different lens that you've watched the database market from your heritage and Facebook and other places. Maybe your perspective on the database industry and how you end up here at Yugabyte.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting that, I think what you talked about, Ed, about open source and databases and that being transformative, right? Like it's a completely different angle, but it's the same story that was unfurling, right? Which is pretty interesting. So I was at Facebook in 2007. I joined Facebook, right? And at that time, the challenges that we were facing there was the fact that, we had so much data, we couldn't deal with just data on a single node, right? Whether by virtue of how many queries you could serve or by virtue of how much data you needed to store. At least Facebook was growing incredibly fast, right? And we decided we needed to build a database, right? So we ended up building this system. Internally, we called it this peer storage database thing, right? And nobody liked peer storage database thing. So they said, like, you know what, give it a simple name. So we came up with the name Cassandra, right? Because it was modeled after Oracle, right? The second most famous Oracle, because Delphi was taken by Delphic. So anyways, and then we open sourced it, right? That happened after we named the database, built the database, got it to work for something. We said, let's open source it because then it'll be available to a lot of people. It encourages hiring. It gets people to understand the type of things we're doing. If there's other companies facing similar problems, we'll be able to share, right? Because the infrastructure is just a means to the end, right? Like in places like Facebook. So it was then that at least I would firsthand witness the dramatic power of open source because it was kind of on the rise at the time. And in 2007, I didn't think twice about it. Sure, yeah, we open sourced it in mid 2008 after building it for a year and a half, almost 2 years. Yeah, I thought, sure, we open sourced it. Great. Now a few people would come. We'd sit down and talk about how we improve things and it'd be great. But the thing just took off, right? Like it just took off like crazy. Never expected that level of growth. Like Cassandra's almost pretty common name now if you think about it, and everybody uses it. A lot of people contribute. There's a huge community around it, and so that was the time for aha for me about how the world of databases has transformed and people are going towards open source. Right. Subsequently, I had the fortune of working on many other open source projects. I immediately afterward worked on Apache HBase, which is another open source database, and we took it and put it into production for some really, really massive scale workloads. Like we're talking many petabytes of data and many billions of transactions per day and so on. And subsequently here at Yugabyte, where the things that we kept hearing about Cassandra and HBase, the NoSQL databases, were that our focus was simple. Our focus was databases cannot scale with respect to moving compute and data off a single node. That's all we're going to solve, right? We're not going to bother with the language and the complexity of richness and all of that. So yeah, that's all secondary, right? Like we cannot do this. We should be able to do that. That was hard enough, right? So we did that. And then slowly we realized, what, we came up with this API that works great for the specific set of Facebook applications we were building. We built the apps around the database and that we could do that at Facebook. But then developers at large used to come back and say, oh, I want this one other pattern, and then that one other pattern. And how about this other thing? And oh, it's not a teeny bit to ask this other thing, isn't it? And pretty soon you're like, oh, good God, this doesn't even work. The architecture was never built for this. And you're just like completely off. So we said, fine, let's do it again. We've done 2 databases. Let's do the third one, but let's do it right this time. And the world also has shifted. There was no SSDs back then. Now SSDs are standard, right? There was no cloud, no zone, no region. All of this was like new stuff that happened ever since, right? So the architecture also needed to take a tilt. But what we find is that Postgres absolutely has the power, exactly as you said, to take on a wide variety of workloads, and irrespective of the features of the database. So I'd say even from the perspective of divorcing the feature set from the underlying capability, the feature set of Postgres is just incredible.
So maybe we should drill into that for a second. So here, let's fast forward. Here we are in 2021, and you both have mentioned the growth we've seen in the Postgres community. And it seems to me the key factors have been, and you hit on it at a bit, but the open source and kind of independence of the community, if you will, has been a plus. Built for enterprise feature needs and use cases has been a plus. It seems like better concurrency and scale, and then easier to deploy and manage than something like MySQL, et cetera, or others. So Ed, maybe comment about that. Like, what do you think the key factors that you're hearing of why you've seen the record growth you've seen in the Postgres community?
Yeah, I think you hit a lot of them kind of at a high level. Look, if we think about Postgres technical capabilities. I mean, at the end of the day, companies like EDB, our whole focus is on engineering and helping to contribute to and build out a stronger Postgres. So if you look across the landscape of, whether that's performance, scalability, security, like key areas of development in Postgres, we've seen that the core of Postgres technology, 13 years ago, Postgres was respected, but it couldn't offer performance parity, couldn't offer feature parity to the extent we needed it to against technologies like Oracle. Now, fast forward 13 years, because a company like EDB is involved, and not just EDB, but because we have this singular focus on providing that capability to enterprise, we are this natural converge point for the next set of important improvements and enhancements. And that's actually the role we play at EDB. And I think we've been contributing that back to the community reliably. And I can say this now with 13 years of hindsight, over 13 years. And I think that that kind of fast cycle, repeat cycle with customers has really allowed us to build a stronger and better Postgres. So I think it starts with the underpinnings of technical competence of Postgres. Of course, the fact that Postgres is a multi-model database, the fact that Postgres is extensible, as you guys well know, that's one of the hidden beauties. It's a hidden superpower of Postgres that a lot of people that aren't otherwise focused or technically oriented to what's inside Postgres wouldn't understand. But I think it is one of Postgres superpowers.
And maybe Karthik, you want to add to that, because that is a bet you made, you and Conan and Mikhail, the foundation of Yugabyte. Maybe talk a bit more about that from why Postgres.
Yeah, I think what Ed is talking about over the past 13 years, we got to do over the past 4 or 5 years, right? Like we revisited that very, very question, why Postgres, at that time frame. And the things that we found were that, as Ed said, the first most important thing for a database is the set of functionality it can subsume, right? Like how many applications can it actually support? So we've seen predominantly 2 different streams of applications, right, in the world today. There are modern applications that are newly being built, completely cloud native, designed from ground up, and they need to handle scale and performance and all of that stuff, right? Now, on the onset, these applications start with a very simple feature set, right? And hence, we built NoSQL, right? And by the way, the NoSQL that we built at places like Facebook, they would subsume the complex functionality behind the scenes, right? It wasn't a part of the database, but it was a part of the database ecosystem around it, where engineering teams and operational teams would take care of that functionality. But that type of a feature set is sufficient for simply dealing with scale, but very simple access patterns, right? Now, once that really got digested and developers got used to it, the next thing was, okay, look, I know how to handle scale, and I have this functionality stuff that I still need to do. Can you give me functionality with scale, right? It kind of keep pushing the boundary, and people often ask for the next thing around the corner. That's the burning need. But when you step back and take a look, at least for me, it was from 2007 through almost 2016, 17, when we started Yugabyte as a company. Over those 10 years, I kept looking at how the next thing around the corner, if you kept adding it, you're getting closer and closer and closer to SQL, right? So SQL is also just the starting point. It's not complete. The ANSI SQL standard defines a few things. But when you look at RDBMSs that are capable, like you look at Oracle and SQL Server and DB2, they have so much more functionality than what the ANSI SQL standard specifies. And that's really used, right? Now, there's one camp that'll cry blood and say those features are not supposed to be used because that's the wrong thing. It kind of ties your business down. Well, what happened 10, 15 years ago is people put business logic and useful paradigms of the database itself, right? Both together, right? So the camp that says don't use those features is saying don't use those features to build your business logic because you don't want to tie the agility of your business logic into the database, rightfully so. But it doesn't mean don't use those features because they can actually help you achieve performance and security and all of this other stuff, right? So at the end, what we realized was you need an incredibly capable database to match the functionality of databases like Oracle and SQL Server and DB2, right? And so Postgres was it. When we looked at it, there were really not too many options in spite of so many databases being around. It was Postgres or MySQL, and Postgres was the one that seemed to have all the feature set, right? The second thing very attractive about Postgres was the extensibility, as Ed said. You could build more with just the type of modular structure that Postgres had, so that the end users, they don't have to learn too much, and they could still be a separate group contributing to whatever the new patterns that come up are. And the third thing is the complete openness, right? Like people really want to know and contribute and control the roadmap, or at least understand the roadmap and have that transparency. And they say, look, you know what, I'm at this point heavily invested in, say, Postgres or whatever the database is. I don't mind investing a little more in building the features I want if no one has time. Can I do that? Do I have the option to do that, right? Or if I'm so deeply invested, I don't want to pay too much to any vendor. Maybe it's a little more cheaper for me to insource my actual work that I need, right? These are all options for companies or enterprises, and these are important options, right? The freedom and the simplicity, and even the legal, getting through the legal procedures is going to be much easier, right? So these are some of the reasons why I think Postgres is really taking off, and why we placed the bet on Postgres even just as recently as 4 or 5 years ago.
And Ed, we've spent some time here talking about Postgres specifically, but I'll let you plug here EDB a bit. Like, what makes EDB special beyond kind of core Postgres? I'm thinking about your enterprise edition,
Sure.
And what are the things that customers care about that have driven the things you've built on top of Postgres?
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate the setup. And I do want to touch the bag though. First and foremost, the thing we spend most of our engineering time on is core Postgres. That's creating the foundation, the enhancements that go into the database server itself. But not surprisingly, a database server like Postgres doesn't really live in isolation in an enterprise. In fact, it interacts and interoperates with an entire stack of technologies. And so there is some founding technology that we developed back even before I joined. It was what the company was founded on, to make it easier to migrate specifically from Oracle onto Postgres. And Karthik, you talked a little bit about some of those kind of application specific code that is intimately linked to the database. And everybody knows, the kind of history of Oracle stored procedures and functions and the like. And at EDB, we developed some intellectual property for making Postgres compatible with Oracle. And that means it's not a translation layer. We've trained Postgres to be able to operate those functions and those stored procedures that would be written into an application that's running on Oracle. And I think that's kind of one of EDB's our kind of founding claim to fame, and it's played forward over many, many years. So we have a lot of customers who are anxious to migrate away from Oracle, and we make that, easier really than any company has ever done before. Of course, as we've gotten bigger and bigger into the enterprise, we've also recognized that there are things that our customers want that inherently Postgres doesn't do, and the project isn't focused on. And so if you think about all the peripheral technologies to be able to run Postgres at scale, let me keep it in the traditional context, because I know you guys have I think a lot to offer in maybe a less differently than the way we would look at it. But those are things like enterprise class management and backup and recovery, failover, a whole host of technologies that we would think of as tools, although we don't really position them or sell them as tools, that kind of complement the database and allow you to run it at scale. And so we've built all those capabilities. We have engineers that focus on those things. Those behave in our engineering organization like separate projects and products. Some of them intersect open source projects, some don't. But those really represent the underpinning. And I think that it's from that place that we found our intersection with Yugabyte so compelling.
Yeah, and that's a good segue. What I wanted to talk about next, which is why we're here together and how we think about partnering. And I think the best partnerships are formed when customers point you together, which is what's happening with us. And maybe just to back up and talk about that for a second, that I think the way this got started was that, our view is we have a holistic view of helping clients move to this distributed SQL database world, right? Which is a change. And candidly, moving off Oracle, for example, you find a whole range of needs that may not need everything that Yugabyte offers, right? And so, I was thinking about a recent customer conversation that we had And the way they were characterizing it into kind of 4 buckets. There's some stuff running on Oracle that's just too intertwined and they don't want to touch, basically. There's other stuff that they've put in Oracle for no good reason. Maybe it shouldn't even be in a database, right? It should be in a storage tier, et cetera. And then there's the 2 main buckets that I think, you and I are mainly focused on, which is, can I just replatform or move off Oracle into Postgres or EDB Postgres? And then there's a bucket that we would say refactoring, to Karthik's point about, hey, the business logic sitting in there, maybe that's better in a microservice, and we need all the cloud native attributes of something like Yugabyte. So, but the problem statement, as you know, Ed, from the customer side is they don't really know at the beginning of the journey. This is a journey. This is going to take some time, right? And they're not sure how all of that fits together. And so they started to show up asking us, you and I, hey, is there a way for you all to team to kind of take on all of this together? And, with Postgres as the kind of North Star here of where they want to move, which is, from our perspective, was, the right thing to do from the customer perspective. And I think good for EDB and obviously good for Yugabyte. So maybe I'll pause there, Ed, your comments on kind of the partnership opportunity and that, that broader market opportunity and how customers think about us working together.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting evolution, because you can imagine as we've built the business, what's underneath the consecutive quarters of growth. It's deeper and deeper relationships, frankly, with large scale enterprise. I mean, if you looked at our business, still 80% of our business is coming from global 2000 companies. And as we've made Postgres more prominent in those businesses, we've also been exposed to areas where Postgres itself, in its native state, the thing that we're best at, doesn't quite cover the kind of workloads that they're interested in using Postgres for. And I think that's where we've seen this really interesting opportunity emerge, which is to say that there are, you said it, I think, really well, Bill, that, we're moving towards Postgres as our North Star, but if it's our North Star, then it needs to be able to do a range of things, some of which is in the Postgres wheelhouse today, and some of it isn't. And I think that's where, the work that you guys have done there at Yugabyte is so compelling and so powerful, because people can kind of hold on to that center point of Postgres, but also now really leverage and exploit the power of the technology overall by taking it to more and more critical areas, and the areas that you guys are focused on, which are cloud native in nature, and operating at a kind of a global distributed scale that inherently Postgres doesn't do on its own very well.
Absolutely. And Karthik, you've been heavily involved in these discussions with these customers. Your view on this whole migration that's going on, and where things fit.
Yeah, no, I think all of you guys pretty much hit it on the head. I think from the customer's point of view, it's what's most interesting at this point is to make their applications cloud native, or make their applications run in a place, whether it's a private cloud, public cloud, it doesn't matter. They want to move to that type of a scenario. They want to move to a database where they know, where it's headed and how they can build their app and how they can continue to double down their focus on. And if they need newer types of features, they should know that, the community will, or themselves, they'll be able to control their destiny, right? So these are the important things. The immediate next thing that you see after that is, the viability, right? Is there such a product and a vendor? Because all of these enterprises, they want, the commercial support. They want to make sure these applications are business critical, and they don't want to, they don't want them ever going down, and they don't want to reinvent the wheel and learn it the hard way. So is it backed by credible people that can, really help them achieve what they want? And then the next question after that is there a path, right? Like, okay, it's great. And now that I have a source location, and then I have a destination I can go to, and a few options in the destination that can take care of a variety of my workloads. Is there a path to doing so? Like, how does the actual specifics of getting from point A to point B look? And finally, there's a question of some of these workloads as they migrate, and they're also, taking the time to refactor and improve this, whatever the existing situation is, to bring it to how they should be running, instead of, I was too afraid to touch it. It's just too gnarly. Nobody really knows what's going on. I didn't want to touch the thing. To, okay, now that I'm doing all this stuff, maybe I'll take the time to make it better and bring it and modernize it. So in that process, they come upon, okay, maybe I thought this is all I needed in terms of scale or availability or whatever geographic distribution of data or whatever it is. But now I actually realize if I'm modernizing it, it's actually going to look like a different application and my users are expecting something else. And what's the option there, right? Is it going to be extremely complicated for me to build this on Postgres, or is there an option there, right? Because with databases like Oracle, you actually do have Oracle RAC and Exadata, and you have a lot of other options that are distributed and highly available. So the notion of what is a cloud native version of the app is not new. The notion of running it in the cloud to make it a cloud native version with commodity hardware is, right? So I think when you look at all of this holistically, I think the customers would start thinking about the move and would start realizing this value only if all of these questions are answered, right? If you leave any one of these dangling, it's like, yeah, that's great, but there's too many unknowns. We'll just wait, right? Like, so I think the time is now. It looks like all pieces have finally snapped in place, and it's a great time.
And to that point, Karthik, what are the, if you're one of these Oracle customers and thinking about this journey, what do you think the 2 or 3 aha moments are for them that tip them in this direction? Like, what do you think makes the difference?
Yeah, I'll actually talk about what we've observed with a lot of these customers, right? When going through, well, the first set of questions are around, can you even do this without Oracle, right? Like, or without Oracle, I mean, Oracle is a proxy for DB2, SQL, or whatever, right? But like, let's just stick to Oracle, right? So can you even do this? And that comes down to questions like, does the other database out there have the functional feature set? It's open source, after all, it's being done. I mean, the notion that people have of open source, I guess, at the periphery is like, it's being done by a bunch of people for free on their free time, right? Like, and so have they really built stuff that can come? I mean, it's really not the view of the world today, but anyways, I mean, it's still the cursory view of open source, right? So for people who are used to traditional vendor-based products. So, it's like, does there exist the equivalent functional set in the database for me to move? Otherwise, it's not viable. The immediate next question that comes up is, what does performance look like? Because I have this thing on custom hardware, custom build, really good. And now you're telling me move to a cloud, everything is noisy, everything fails. Like, does it really even work, right? So that question comes up quite a bit. And then so once you answer those 2, right, like the viability of running it, then the real question comes up around, how does the management of this thing look? What does the feature set look like? What are the other things that I need to think about or be worried about in trying, because it's a shift of not just databases, it's a shift of the applications, it's a shift of the ecosystem, the people, the training, everything, right? So what does that look like? And finally, then they start looking at, in the case of YugabyteDB, at least the reason some of they come in here is for scale in the future or built-in replication or surviving failures of various kinds. So they really go through that to see, can you keep all of the stuff we talked about constant and deliver on these extra things that you say you would do, right? Of course, security is a running theme throughout. It comes up pretty early. Like, if you're not able to meet the security, or at least the subset of security that Oracle has that is required by these enterprises, it doesn't matter. Everything could be great. It's not going into production anyway, right? So I would say the simplest way to think about this is viability in many different dimensions, because otherwise it's a fool's errand, right? Everything looks great, but you can't run it in production. Nobody wants to get there. So viability is front loaded, and then it's around like, what is the learning and what is the actual art of the possible in terms of moving stuff.
Great. And Ed, your view of that question, like, what are, when customers start to move in this direction, what are the things they're asking for, or what are the things on the horizon that you guys are working on?
Yeah, I think, Karthik, you hit the nail on the head. I think, obviously, our customers more and more are thinking about the nature of the way they're deploying their applications. I mean, we've grown up with them in the traditional data center. And so, in addition to the, migrating those applications in the context of the data center, they're simultaneously using this movement to cloud to rethink how they deploy, and those 2 things are kind of converging. So among many important things that we're working on, obviously, and I think you guys know this, we're working on our database as a service, which we just launched in a preview last week and goes into GA and the beginning of Q4. And I think that represents a really important intersection with our customers' needs as they go forward. And by the way, it's worth noting that pattern and that interest is also exposing them to how, to the nature of deployment and creation of new apps for the cloud. And we talked about that a minute ago, some of which I think we handle well with Postgres, and some of it we think And we've seen our customers really have a need for the kind of capabilities that you guys have built there at Yugabyte. So we'll, but our wheelhouse will continue to be, we got 650 people in the company, 300 of them focus on Postgres. So our wheelhouse is going to continue to be and always focus on Postgres and making Postgres better in all the ways that we can. And we want to find more ways to get Postgres and in the work we do with you guys into a context that doesn't hold them into one cloud, but allows them to work across clouds. And because we have an on-prem component, we want them to work kind of universally in whatever environment they're in. So we got an additional axe to grind relative to Postgres that we still got a lot of deployments on-prem, but our customers want to deploy in neutral of any one cloud vendor and have more flexibility. I think we'll start to see that shift away from these walled gardens that have now become cloud walled gardens. We used to say they're Oracle walled garden. Now we've got the cloud walled gardens.
Yeah, we're certainly seeing that you have to run in the public clouds, but you have to run in their own data center and their own private cloud. And then increasingly this emerging tier around edge and IoT. I don't know, Karthik, if you want to comment about that trend as well.
Yeah, that's a pretty exciting trend. It's a new trend for sure, but it definitely feels like there's something there, right? Like with fundamental technology shifts like 5G and just more bandwidth and COVID forcing us into remote everything, right? Like so it now gives birth to the need for applications that interact quickly with users, but also a central way for people to consume applications, as well as the people building these solutions to see globally what's going on, right? Like if you put it in the context of the variety of different verticals, right? If you think about, for example, retail, right? Like now you could have a lot of storefronts and maybe you want to do, like no contact checkout or something, right? Like, and that means it's an application where you really quickly interact with it. You check out, you need to get out of the way really quickly before the next guy gets in line or gets close to you. So, and so on. But you still need to transport all of this stuff to a central location where people can go view what's going on, or even the grocer or the e-commerce company can go and stock the right warehouses with the right kind of stuff and look at demand and predict how much they need to stock and so on, right? So that's an example. A similar example, and you can kind of come up with this example everywhere, right? Smart cars, for example, very simple. Like e-banking is another simple example. Drive to the hospital and now you can get automatically checked in by the location of your phone, another example. So we just don't realize how many places this has permeated our lives. And the pattern here is fundamentally the same, right? You need something in the edge close to where the application or the device is running, and you need to be able to absorb the data coming in, but you need to be able to build value-added apps over time, right? Now, the point is you don't know what apps are going to make sense over time and what features they will require. And so you need the sophistication of a well thought out and powerful database at the edge. And you need all of that to move to the center by replicating, doing something, right? So this paradigm we're seeing quite a bit, and Postgres seems to be a natural choice because so many developers know it. They know it has the comfort of giving them all the features that they need into the future, so they're insured as far as building the app, and the agility is there, right? So.
Great, and maybe we'll leave it at that. Ed, any closing comments from your side as you think about this whole discussion and our partnership?
No, I think I think that I think what we're experiencing is the result of enterprises moving to a new condition, a new state. It not just in the way they think about their infrastructure and the way they're building applications and in the way they're deploying them. And we said it repeatedly. Postgres is a great foundational technology for that, but the ability to enhance Postgres with capabilities like you've developed there at Yugabyte is what creates the more universal appeal and the more universal power.
That's great. And maybe the one closing comment I would make, that it's also important, we're dealing with the largest companies around the globe together. And I think beyond the technology and the partnership, what they look for is trust, right? And so being able to look you and I in the eye and say, hey, you're going to put our interests first in how you cooperate and work together is really important to us. So I appreciate our partnership and our friendship on this journey together.
Me too.
Okay. Thanks, Ed.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Ed.